speaker, Dr. Nichole Sheldrick, who is a senior research associate in digital archaeology for the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project, known as EAMINA, at the University of Leicester. She started her archaeological career with a BA degree in classics and archaeology in 2004 from McMaster University in Canada, followed by an MA in classical archaeology in 2008 from the University of Alberta. She then moved to the University of Oxford, where she studied for a DPhil in archaeology, which was awarded in 2016. Nichole began her collaboration with the EAMINA and related projects as a research associate at Oxford in 2015, where she was based until 2020. She then moved to Leicester, first in the capacity of training manager as part of a project sponsored by the British Council Cultural Protection Fund, which was followed by her current position of EAMINA Senior Research Associate. Her present research focuses on the archaeology and heritage of ancient North Africa, as well as on the application of automatic change detection methods for satellite imagery to heritage management and protection. Over the past 10 years, Nichole has actively participated in fieldwork across North Africa, including excavations as part of the Tunisian British Utica project from 2012 to 2016, and the Mannings Archaeological Project from 2017 to 2018. And then, since 2018, she has been involved with the Middle Dra project, the University of Leicester, and with the subsequent AHRC-funded project, Making Oasis Civilization in the Moroccan Sahara. The Society for Libyan Studies was very pleased to publish Nichole's monograph in November 2021, titled Building the Countryside, Rural Architecture and Settlement in Tripolitania during the Roman and Late Antique periods. This is a significant contribution that brings together data on the architecture and construction of over 2,000 rural structures across Tripolitania, dating from the 1st century BC through to the 7th century AD. The book is available to purchase via the Society's website, where it can also be downloaded as an open access ebook. Tonight's lecture will present the main results of this publication, as well as the range of data and methodologies that were applied to this important study. So now, without further ado, Nichole, the floor is all yours.
Right. Okay, so thank you very much, Nichole, for that very, very kind introduction, and also for inviting me to speak to the Society today. I'm really very honored and pleased to be giving a talk to the Society about my book, and very grateful to the Society for publishing it. And so I hope that it is something that you will all find interesting today. So for my lecture this afternoon, as Nichole has just said, and you can see from the title on the screen, what I'm going to talk about today is the rural architecture and settlement in Tripolitania during the Roman and late antique periods. So just to start by situating ourselves in the world, the ancient region of Tripolitania covers approximately this area outlined in yellow, stretching across the northwest part of modern Libya and the southern part of modern Tunisia. Now, if we zoom in on this area, Tripolitania, as we can see on the map here, can be divided into a number of different zones that had very different diverse environmental conditions. In the north, of course, was the coastal plain. You can see here home to the well-known coastal cities like Leptis Magna and Sabratha. And then to the south of the coastal plain and stretching in an arc from Leptis Magna over here to Takapi in the west, were the hills and mountains known collectively as the Jebel. And this area was and is the area of Tripolitania with the highest level of rainfall, and is the most agriculturally fertile part of the region. Behind the Jebel and moving further south were the pre-desert zones, crossed by these large seasonal wadi systems of the Sefedjan and Zemzem basins here, and these drained out to the sea. And then finally to the east, we had the very dry and desert-like region of Serdica here. Now, Tripolitania is very well known for its spectacular Roman period architecture. The monuments of the coastal cities of Leptis Magna, here we have the Severan Basilica, Sabratha with its wonderful temple, and the Arch of Marcus Aurelius at Oia. These monuments and many others have captured the attention and imagination of travelers and scholars for centuries, and they are really evidence of the rich culture and the great wealth of these ancient cities. Now, the architecture and settlement of Tripolitania's countryside was very different to that of the cities in many ways, but it is no less important and no less spectacular in their own way. Throughout the countryside, we find lavish coastal villas. We have towering fortified farmhouses and monumental mausolea, all of which are also striking evidence of large numbers of people not only surviving, but thriving in what were often quite challenging rural environments, particularly in the more southern areas of the pre-desert. However, it's also true that a far larger proportion of rural buildings are not nearly so impressive. Most rural buildings tended to be of much simpler construction with little extant decoration, and this made many of them very difficult or impossible to date without other forms of evidence. In addition, while the impressive still standing structures make for better pictures, much of the evidence that we have for architecture in the countryside is not quite so impressive anymore, usually surviving only as a series of low walls or piles of rubble in the countryside, as you can see in some of the examples on the screen. So for these reasons and others, rural farm buildings, particularly the small, unremarkable ones, have not always received the same amount of attention as the larger or more impressive structures of the urban sites. Nevertheless, large or small, lavish or plain, these rural structures all have interesting things to tell us about ancient life in the countryside. Now, of course, while rural buildings have probably received less attention on the whole than the urban buildings at the urban sites, that is obviously not to say that they've received no attention. And of course, over the last 100 years and more, there have been a number of studies and surveys that have recorded and discussed many of these structures. And so I'd just like to start here by highlighting a few of these. Some of the earliest records of Tripolitania's rural buildings come from the accounts of early European travelers in the region. In the 19th century, more and more explorers were beginning to strike out into Tripolitania's interior. And while these were not archaeological expeditions per se, many of these explorers left behind detailed and valuable accounts and drawings of the things they saw. These really wonderful illustrations on the screen here are from Barth's Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa, which was published in 1857. Here we can see on the left the monumental entrance to a fortified building in the Wadi Sefedjan, the Roman period mausoleum known as Gazardoga in the upper right, and in the bottom right, a structure which today is clearly and immediately recognizable as an olive press, but which at the time sort of mystified Barth and other early explorers who thought they were some kind of religious monument. Skipping forward a little bit in time into the 20th century, particularly following the Second World War, more and more archaeologists began to take an interest in the Roman period monuments which dotted Tripolitania's countryside and began to conduct more formal archaeological surveys. A number of British archaeologists like John B. Ward Perkins, Richard Goodchild, David Oates, and Olwen Brogan conducted and published several important surveys in various parts of the Jebel and pre-desert regions during the 1950s, documenting hundreds of rural sites and structures. They drew useful maps, detailed building plans, and also started incorporating techniques such as aerial photography into their work, as seen in this image here, laying the foundations for much of the work on Tripolitania's countryside that has happened since. By this time, it was now understood that the monuments Barth and others had identified as religious monuments were in fact huge Roman period olive presses. And so one particularly important area of research that developed in this period was into the important role that olive farming played in the wealth of the coastal cities and Tripolitania's economy. Another extremely important study was the excavations Brogan and DJ Smith undertook at the site of Girza in the 1950s. Girtsa was one of the largest settlements known in the pre-desert, consisting of over 40 individual buildings, including some of the largest known rural structures recorded in the region, extensive evidence for agriculture, and multiple cemeteries with at least 14 monumental mausolea, one of which is illustrated on the cover of the monograph here. In Tunisia, at the same time, French archaeologists were also undertaking a number of important surveys, particularly on the military sites in the southern part of the country. One particularly important and useful survey that I just want to mention was this volume here, the Recherches sur les limes tripolitaines, published in 1974. The survey had been undertaken by Maurice Usenat and Paul Trousset and presented a detailed and important account of over 100 rural sites along the frontier in southern Tunisia. In addition, beginning in the 1990s, Tunisia's National Heritage Agency, the INP, began publishing their national map of archaeological sites, in which hundreds of rural sites have been recorded and published based on historic maps and new fieldwork, and this important and useful work is still ongoing. Now, back in Libya, one of the most extensive and ambitious survey projects undertaken in the region, and one which will be familiar to many members of the society, was the Unesco Libyan Valleys Survey. The ULVS survey, for short, was carried out by a Libyan-British team in the 1980s in a large area of the pre-desert, covering approximately 75,000 square kilometers of this pre-desert region south of Tripoli in the Safejan and Zemzem Wadi basins. Now, one of the main things that they set out to address was this long known but little understood fact that the archaeological evidence quite clearly indicated that the pre-desert had been much more densely populated and more intensively cultivated than it is today. The project collected data on well over 2,000 sites, ranging from prehistoric to modern times, though most of the sites that they recorded dated from the late 1st to mid-7th centuries AD. Importantly, their findings emphasized a picture of cultural continuity and the importance of pre-existing local land use and irrigation technologies in the success of these settlements. Significantly, for my purposes, the data they collected allowed them to expand and improve on some of the earlier settlement and building typologies, which had previously been developed by Goodchild and Brogan. But for various reasons, this was not necessarily the main focus of their investigations, and so these were not always applied consistently. Finally, I just also really want to mention briefly the important and in-depth survey undertaken by Mufti al-Haddad in the Jebel Tarhuna, in which he recorded a large number of ancient farms and settlements on the Tarhuna Plateau, with a particular emphasis on the evidence for olive, wine, and amphora production, and also, as you can see here, recently published by the Society. Now, this was just a very quick and summary review of just some of the archaeological work that has looked at Tripolitania's countryside. And what I hope this has illustrated is just a couple of things. First, that over the last 100 years and more, there has been quite a lot of work done in the region, and a huge amount of data has been collected about the sites, settlements, and buildings of Tripolitania's ancient countryside. However, what I hope may also have started to come through is that while a number of important topics have been investigated, such as settlement patterns, agricultural production and the economy, the military, and some in-depth examinations of individual sites, few of these studies have really focused very specifically on the rural structures themselves in terms of really looking systematically at their architecture and construction. Furthermore, no one had yet looked at this huge and growing data set as a group across the entire region. So a number of important questions about wider regional trends in the construction and development and the use of these rural buildings across Tripolitania remained unanswered or insufficiently addressed. And so this is what I set out to try and do. So in this study, I essentially had two main aims. The first was to compile all of the data that I could find on the architecture and construction of rural buildings in Tripolitania during the Roman and late antique periods into a single standardized database. As I just mentioned, while there was clearly a huge amount of data available, it had been collected at different times by different people and projects and for different purposes, which sometimes had very little to do with recording architecture. And therefore, much of it was not directly comparable in its original form. So it was really important for me to bring all of these data together into a standardized format, which enabled me to undertake a number of quantitative analyses and make meaningful comparisons for buildings and settlements across the entire region in a more systematic way and on a wider scale than has previously been possible. The second aim was then to use these data and analyses to try and answer some questions about the development and use of the rural farm buildings which were constructed and used in Tripolitania, including things like how and why were buildings in different parts of rural Tripolitania similar or different, when and why were certain architectural forms and technologies adopted, and how do we explain some of these differences? So I'll start first with a few words about my methodology. I began my data collection by recording the sites and information that were available in published sources, some of the ones that I just mentioned and many others. And you can see the approximate areas of a number of these surveys on the map in the white outlines here. So for example, this large area in the pre-desert numbered 4 here shows the extent of the Unesco Libyan Valleys survey. The bulk of my data collection took place between 2011 and 2015, during which time it was unfortunately not possible for me to visit Libya. So where possible, I located the sites using open access satellite imagery via Google Earth or Bing Maps. Now, this was a really very useful exercise because while some of the more recent surveys published coordinates which could be used to find the sites, many were conducted before GPS technology was widely available. And in some cases, all that existed and were published were very approximate sketch maps and descriptive locations. So the first major thing that this allowed me to do was to record more accurate locations for quite a large number of the sites and to create updated distribution maps. Tripolitania is especially well suited for using satellite imagery to identify archaeological sites and buildings, particularly in the pre-desert areas. Thanks to the excellent preservation of many sites, the relatively sparse vegetation in the region, and the almost complete lack of widespread modern development beyond the coast. So just to illustrate that, what we can see here are 3 farm buildings which were identified and published in the UNESCO Libyan Valleys survey, and you can see how clearly they show up in the detail that is visible. So in addition to locating these sites, thanks to the high resolution of much of the imagery, I was also able to confirm, add, and correct where necessary things like site dimensions and plans for a large number of the buildings. As I just mentioned, while many of the previous surveys had recorded the presence of one or more buildings, sometimes they were not really concerned with the specific plans or architecture of the buildings because they were interested in other aspects of the sites. So sometimes the measurements were only very roughly estimated and plans only very roughly sketched, or sometimes these things were not even recorded or published at all. And so I was able to use the satellite imagery to fill in a lot of the gaps in our information about these buildings. In this particular case, I should note, however, there was actually already a good deal of information that was recorded and published by the ULVS team, including a sketch plan of this site over here, KN44. And we can see that in this case, in fact, it was already fairly accurate. So there was really not too much more for me to add, but this was not always the case. So overall, again, this was just a really extremely useful tool and exercise during my data collection. However, it was also during the course of identifying and mapping the previously published sites using satellite imagery that it also started to become clear that there were a huge number of sites and structures within and around the published survey areas that had not previously been recorded. So if we zoom out a little bit, and we can still see our 3 sites up here in the upper right, if we look a little bit further down this side wadi here, there's actually another building which was not recorded by the ULVS team as far as I can tell, but which I was then able to add to my catalog. Now, I do just want to emphasize here so that it's very clear that this is in no way a reflection on the quality or thoroughness of previously published surveys. Anyone who's conducted a survey like this in the field knows that there's just so many limiting factors of time and resources, and it's just simply not possible to record every single detail about every single site that you come across, or to follow every track and find every site that might be lurking out there. But what this does illustrate, then, is one of the main advantages of satellite imagery survey, in that it offers a level of speed of survey and access to sites that might be difficult or to access or in dangerous locations. But we can also remember that there are several obvious drawbacks to satellite imagery survey. High among them for my purposes, that it can tell us little or nothing about things like construction materials and techniques, and can tell us very little information about their date. All we can say in this case, for example, is that its proximity and similarity of appearance to the sites that were recorded on the ground by the ULVS team suggests very strongly that it was probably built using similar techniques and probably dates to the same period, but we cannot know for certain until someone can get out to confirm these things on the ground. So nevertheless, despite some of these drawbacks to satellite imagery, it was clear that taking advantage of this imagery would allow me to add a great deal of data on both existing and previously unknown sites. So I decided to conduct a limited amount of new remote satellite survey to augment the existing data set. And the areas marked in red, as you can see on the map here, is where I conducted these surveys. In the end, sites which I identified solely using satellite imagery, most of which, as far as I can tell, are previously unrecorded, account for around a third of the sites in my catalog. For each building, whether published or newly discovered via satellite imagery, I recorded data on a number of different quantitative and qualitative characteristics, including things like plan, size, construction techniques, presence of press structures, and evidence of decorative or, where relevant, defensive features. On the screen here, what you can just see a glimpse of is the final version of my catalog, in which, if anyone is interested, is available also to download from the Society's website. Now, just to mention, in order to protect the locations of some of the more vulnerable sites, I decided not to include the coordinates for the sites in the published catalog, but just incidentally here, I'll mention, if there are researchers or students who are interested, I am very happy to share these for research purposes, and anyone can contact me directly or apply for access to the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa online database. The website is here, where my database, or my data set, has also been incorporated. So in total, using both the previously published surveys and the satellite survey techniques, I cataloged over 2,400 structures from rural Tripolitania, and you can see the full distribution of those sites here. As you can see on the map as well, I then divided the material into 9 regions for analysis. These regions are based to a certain extent on geographical zones and features such as the Jebel and particular Wadi basins and the extensive previous surveys, but they also take into account patterns that were visible in the overall distribution of the recorded material. It should be kept in mind, therefore, that many of the blank areas on the map provided are not indicative of a lack of sites or settlement, but they're only those areas that have not yet been surveyed or included in my study due to time or availability of data. On a similar note, since the main focus of my study was the analysis of buildings and architecture, the distribution map is not necessarily a distribution of known settlement in the region. While it goes without saying that architecture and settlement are very strongly related, my focus was very much on the buildings themselves, and with few exceptions, I only recorded sites for which something could be said about the buildings that were present in terms of their size, construction, or other physical characteristics. So this means that any settlements which were only indicated by scatters of ceramic material, for example, which is sometimes the case in areas of intensive modern agriculture, these were not included. This meant that a large number of known settlement sites, for example, on the island of Jerba and closer to the coast, were therefore not included in my analyses. Finally, you'll also notice that I divided the buildings into 3 different broad categories: military buildings, unfortified buildings, and fortified buildings. And I'm not going to talk about the military buildings today due to the limited time, but we'll turn now to look at the other 2 categories of structures, starting with the unfortified buildings. Now, if we back up for just a moment, it's important to note that before the 1st century BC, rural settlement in Tripolitania does not appear to have extended very far beyond the immediate hinterlands of the coastal urban centers. We have some evidence for small rural centers at oases, and there's increasing evidence for early hilltop settlements which were scattered across the region. However, it appears that in most of rural Tripolitania, the landscape was utilized and occupied by semi-nomadic pastoralists, and otherwise the majority of the countryside seems to have been unsettled, at least in the permanent sense. Our understanding of the chronological development of rural settlement in Tripolitania during these periods is largely based on the recovery and dating of ceramics, particularly fine wares, which have been collected during various surveys in the region. The graphs on the screen show the distribution of dated fine wares by 50-year increments in a few different parts of Tripolitania. Now, this is not without its problems. While ceramic data from surface collection can tell us that a site was probably occupied, or at the very least was the site of some human activity during a particular period, they can usually not tell us a lot with certainty about the establishment, construction, development, or abandonment of specific buildings. Nevertheless, due to the scarcity of excavated buildings in rural Tripolitania, surface ceramic data is often all that we have to go on in terms of dating sites. And it's of course not my intention to suggest that we cannot or should not use this very valuable material. But it's just important to emphasize that the chronological picture that is suggested by the survey evidence is really one of imported fineware use and distribution. And the degree to which fineware and other ceramic data, particularly that collected from surface survey, can or should be used as a proxy for the chronological development of rural settlement, and crucially, the construction or abandonment of buildings is still up for debate. But all the same, based on this evidence, we can see that some of the earliest evidence for rural settlement in the region dates from as early as the 5th century BC on the island of Jerba in southern Tunisia. But it's not really until the 2nd and 1st centuries BC that we start to see a noteworthy increase in the number of rural sites with fine wares around the coast and in the immediate hinterlands of Leptis Magna, a trend which has been convincingly connected to the idea that the cities were gaining some degree of economic independence following the events of the 2nd and 3rd Punic Wars. Then, in the 1st century AD, we see another increase in the number of rural sites over the previous period. And in the charts on the right-hand side, representing the areas of the Jebel and pre-desert, we can see that this increase is really very substantial. In particular, we can also see, especially in the chart on the lower right, number 6, showing the pre-desert region, which is the evidence from the Unesco Libyan Valleys Survey Project. This leap does not appear to occur until the 2nd half of the 1st century AD. This apparent delay in the spread of fine wares to the pre-desert and Serdica was almost certainly related to the fact that it was not until the 1st century AD that a relative peace with the indigenous peoples of these areas was reached after a series of Roman military actions. And it's only at this point that the people who came to settle these areas begin to take part in the trade and economic activities through which they could acquire these types of goods. We can see in the charts again that the unfortified settlement then seems to reach its peak around the 2nd century AD, but as early as the 3rd century in the coastal regions and into the 4th and 5th centuries AD further inland, we start to see some decline again in the number of unfortified buildings. And we'll come back to this in a little bit, and how the fortified buildings, which you can also see represented on the charts on the right, how these fit into that picture. But for now, I just want to focus on the unfortified buildings. So this increase in rural settlements in the coastal and Jebel regions and the appearance of new permanent stone buildings in the pre-desert and Serdica regions around the 1st century AD seems to be evidence of a widespread move to sedentary settlement over large parts of the region during this time. As far as we can tell, the buildings that people constructed and used during this period can be categorized broadly as unfortified farm buildings. And on the screen, what you see here is a distribution of the buildings that are recorded in this category, which date from approximately the 1st to 4th centuries AD as a group. As you can see, these buildings were found pretty much across the entire region. Unfortified buildings took many forms, but were most commonly composed of varying combinations of single-storied structures and large open spaces bounded by low walls or ranges of rooms, giving them the other name that they're often called, which is open farms. And if we have a look at this building we identified earlier, we can see how this illustrates the basic idea of the form fairly clearly, with a couple areas of 1 or 2 small rooms attached to these large open spaces. Importantly, as the name implies, unfortified buildings are also defined by the characteristics that they did not have. That is, features traditionally interpreted as defensive, like high walls, single entrances, large ditches, etc. However, I think it's worth noting that we should not necessarily assume that unfortified sites were not defendable or that their inhabitants were not concerned with security. For example, we can point to buildings which on the whole can be classified as unfortified, but have possible watchtowers incorporated into their structures. But still, as we'll see a bit later, there is obviously a whole category of building which do have many of these characteristics associated with defense, and which, as we'll see, appear as a group to be later in date. So this is a useful and basic, if imperfect, way of differentiating these two broad types of buildings. So I then further divided these unfortified buildings into a few different types, but really I'm just going to focus today on the two most commonly reported types, which I've called courtyard and farmyard buildings. Courtyard buildings, as you might easily guess, essentially those buildings that are focused around a courtyard. Now, the concept of the courtyard farm is not new, and several previous surveys had used this term. But I began to realize when I was looking at these buildings that not everyone used it in the same way or used the same characteristics to define what made something specifically a courtyard farm. So my definition specifically has those buildings defined as those which had at least two continuous ranges of rooms defining the sides of what was usually a more or less rectangular or square space. As with most building typologies, this is not a perfect system, and there were occasional exceptions, but on the whole, the system does seem to have worked. Far more common than courtyard buildings, however, were what I decided to call farmyard buildings. Now, these structures were defined by large open-air enclosed spaces designated as farmyards, with one or more rooms attached to the open space, but with far less regularity than we saw in the courtyard buildings. These structures could be rectilinear in shape, but they also took a far larger variety of irregular forms than the courtyard buildings did. These buildings could also have additional yards or rooms which extended or supplemented the main construction, and it's easier to imagine how these buildings might have been added to and expanded over long periods of time. In some areas of the eastern pre-desert and Serdica regions, one interesting thing is that in certain instances, these buildings occurred in larger complexes consisting of several rooms and yards attached in varying and irregular combinations, some of these extending several hundred meters in length, as seen in a couple of these examples here on the left. I classified these as open complexes, and again, I'm not really going to talk about them very much today, but this is just to show you kind of an interesting way that these buildings tended to be clustered. Now, if we start by looking at the basic distribution of these two types, we can see that the courtyard buildings, to start, occurred pretty much across the region, with the exception of the far eastern part of Serdica over here. Farmyard buildings, on the other hand, were found primarily in the pre-desert regions and throughout Serdica, with a few noted in the western parts of the region, but none at all were recorded in the Jebel and coastal regions around Leptis Magna here. Now, if we just have a look at this chart, which breaks down the proportions of different building types in different regions, we can see that in those central coastal and Jebel regions, that is those areas in the hinterlands of Leptis Magna and Oya, the courtyard building is by far the most commonly recorded type of structure in this kind of dotted pattern here. In addition, we can see that a large proportion in these regions, in this light gray color here, were recorded simply as open, which indicated that there was not enough information for me to distinguish whether they were farmyard or courtyard plans. And so there's reason to believe that, in fact, many of these undifferentiated ones here are probably also courtyard types as well in this region. While the distribution showed that courtyard buildings did appear in the more southern areas of the pre-desert and Serdica, we can see that they were a clear minority compared to the farmyard buildings represented in this dark gray. So in addition to their plan and distribution, there were several other ways also as well in which courtyard and farmyard farms differed. First was in their size. On average, courtyard buildings were demonstrably larger than other unfortified building types, as much as twice as large on average as farmyard buildings in some areas. You can see on this chart that the black bars show the mean size of courtyard buildings in each of the subregions and overall, and the light gray bars on the right-hand side, the lightest gray ones, show the average size of the farmyard buildings. And this is significant because what it tells us is that courtyard buildings were not just versions of farmyard buildings which happened to have more rooms. Rather, they were a distinct building type, which on average were consistently much larger than the farmyard buildings in the same areas. In addition, we can see that particularly in the western coastal region and in the central coastal and Jebel regions, the courtyard buildings here are, on average, far larger than the courtyard buildings identified in other regions, especially in the pre-desert. Another significant way in which courtyard and farmyard buildings differed was in their construction techniques used. Courtyard buildings were very frequently constructed using ashlar techniques, particularly opus africanum, consisting of piers of ashlar masonry, which, as you can see in the examples on the screen, are often all that remains standing of these buildings. These standing piers were then filled in between with panels of smaller masonry or rubble. And the correlation between courtyard buildings and ashlar techniques was very strong in the coast and Jebel regions, where almost all of the courtyard buildings recorded used one of these techniques. Interestingly, though, a wider variety of techniques was used for courtyard buildings in the more inland regions, but opus africanum was still found in higher proportions for these courtyard buildings than for other types. In the pre-desert regions and Serdica, again, small masonry and coarse rubble techniques were much more common in general, and the majority of farmyard buildings were constructed using one of these techniques. Out of over 200 farmyard buildings where the construction technique was recorded, only one used opus africanum. So there again seems to be a fairly clear difference between the farmyard and courtyard types, where ashlar techniques like opus africanum were associated fairly closely with the courtyard buildings. I also looked at and compared the incidence of both presses and luxury features at both courtyard and farmyard buildings. Now, this map shows a distribution of known olive presses in the region associated with unfortified buildings. And while we can see that they occur in many parts of the region, it's clear that the highest density of presses are to be found in the Jebel, which is obviously unsurprising given that this is the part of the region with the highest levels of rainfall. But what's also important to note is that the majority of presses were found associated with courtyard buildings. Now, again, in the Jebel, this is unsurprising since the majority of buildings recorded there in the first place were courtyard buildings. But what's interesting is that this also holds true in the pre-desert, where the courtyard type was much less common. So while presses were not exclusively found in courtyard buildings in the pre-desert, they were still much more commonly found in courtyard buildings, suggesting again that there was some deliberate relationship between the two. Now, on one hand, we could suggest that a single press, let alone multiple presses, simply need more room due to their size and the area needed for them to operate. And since we've already demonstrated that courtyard buildings tended to be larger, it's perhaps logical that presses appear in the larger buildings. However, if we look at the incidence of things that are broadly categorized as luxury features as well, such as the presence of sculpture, marble, painted plaster, mosaics, or evidence for bath buildings, what we find is that sites with higher numbers of presses were also more likely to have these kinds of features, suggesting that the need for space was not necessarily the only factor. Like the presses, the majority of unfortified buildings with evidence for luxury features can be found associated with structures that are closer to the coast, and notably again, where they are found in areas further inland, they tend to be found in courtyard buildings. So what all of this adds up to is that the different patterns of distribution and trends in construction support the idea that there was more to this distinction between courtyard and farmyard buildings than simply the degree of regularity or fineness of construction that one had the means to achieve. In the coastal and Jebel regions, especially in the central zones, but also to a lesser extent in the west, large, well-built, unfortified courtyard buildings utilizing ashlar techniques were the norm during the first few centuries AD. This supports previous studies that have emphasized the significant wealth and prosperity of the coastal and Jebel regions during the first few centuries AD. This wealth was based on agricultural production and processing, particularly of olive oil and wine. Many of these courtyard buildings in the coastal and Jebel regions were potentially the centers of larger estates, which were the property of wealthy landowners who lived in the urban centers. The courtyard form was probably the form that was used in the earliest periods of sedentarization in the immediate hinterlands of the coastal cities. The courtyard building had a long history throughout the Mediterranean, with similar structures recorded as early as the 3rd century BC in rural Punic settlements around the Mediterranean. Their adoption in the coastal and Jebel regions of Tripolitania, therefore, seems to have been part of a larger tradition of the form's use in the immediate hinterlands of Hellenistic Punic coastal settlements around the Mediterranean. Its continued use in the coastal and Jebel regions of Tripolitania into the Roman period is therefore not at all surprising, and courtyard buildings are also well attested throughout the rest of Africa Proconsularus during the Roman period. Now, by contrast, in the southern and eastern pre-desert and Serdica regions, As we've seen, the farmyard type buildings were far more common. And while it's important to note that the buildings in this category ranged widely in their size and complexity, on average, these buildings in these regions were generally smaller than those further north. Most of the construction techniques in this region did not employ any type of ashlar masonry, and comparatively few buildings had presses or luxury features. Also worth noting is that in the earliest phases of sedentarization of these areas, we might remember that the construction of stone buildings would have made a distinct mark in the landscape, since there was very little pre-existing stone architecture. The construction of courtyard and even farmyard buildings represented a significant investment of time, effort, and resources, and would therefore have been a very visible and meaningful declaration of participation in a new way of life and a new economic system based on settled agriculture. In addition, stone buildings served as a permanent, immediately visible symbols of wealth and the control of resources, and therefore possibly also status, potentially making the adoption of this kind of architecture and settlement that much more appealing to an elite class. But if we think about the people who actually lived in the pre-desert regions, we can perhaps consider an explanation for the development of the farmyard form over the wholesale adoption of the courtyard form, which was already established in the Jebel and on the coast. As previously mentioned, before the 1st century AD, there are thought to have been very few sedentary inhabitants in the pre-desert, but they were home to various semi-nomadic pastoralist groups. The apparent rapidity and thoroughness with which sedentarization occurred might suggest that there was some common incentive to do so, though we don't really have any evidence for any kind of deliberate or enforced settlement policy. Rather, one possibility is that families or groups that were already successful in the region may have begun to recognize the advantages of participating in larger Roman economic systems. Increasing investment in agriculture while continuing to undertake traditional pastoral activities presented a way for those with large flocks of animals to consolidate and provide more security for their wealth and position. And it's clear that some people in the pre-desert did adopt the courtyard form in the pre-desert areas, but their large size and the incidence of presses and luxury features indicates that it was only the most wealthy people in the region who did so. Far more people in the region appear to have adopted the farmyard form, and this can potentially be seen as a product of the new mixed pastoral agricultural economy being practiced. Corralling and protecting animals was probably a useful function in both courtyards and farmyards, but in the case of the farmyards in particular, I would suggest that in the pre-desert and in Serdica at least, the corralling and stabling of animals when they needed to be gathered together for activities like shearing or for protection from wild animals or thieves was in fact the primary function of the farmyard and the motivation behind the development of the type. The ubiquity of the farmyard form and the clear effort that must have gone into their construction reflects the continued prominence and importance of stock keeping alongside agriculture in the lives of the people in the Eastern pre-desert and Serdica during the Roman and late antique periods. So, if we turn back to our dating evidence now, as previously mentioned, the unfortified buildings that we've just discussed were at their peak between the 1st and 3rd to 4th centuries AD, after which the number of unfortified settlements seems to have begun to decline to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the region. This does not seem to have been so dramatic on the island of Jerba, which is a bit of an outlier, but we can see this trend very clearly in the immediate hinterlands of Leptis Magna and Selene. In these areas, there appears to be an overall decline in rural settlement, and this is probably because the farms in these territories immediately surrounding Leptis Magna were probably more directly connected to the city itself, which suffered greatly in the 4th and 5th centuries AD due to earthquakes and raids, with large parts of the city already abandoned by that period. Similarly, although it's not illustrated on the slide because we don't really have the same amount of ceramic evidence, there was also a steep decline in settlement in the eastern part of Tripolitania. Serdica is probably one of the most difficult regions in Tripolitania to farm. It has extremely low levels of rainfall, and but for a narrow coastal strip, the region is basically desert. It would have required a great deal of effort to maintain any level of agricultural activity in the region. And if the economy of the region overall had taken a downturn, after a certain point, it possibly made more sense for the people in this region to move away or move back to semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyles. However, while we can see that this decline in unfortified buildings also happens in the Jebel Tarhuna and a little bit later in the pre-desert zones, we can see that at the same time, starting in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, we have the appearance and increase in structures that we can identify as fortified. And we'll see, as we'll see, these buildings are clear evidence that at least some people in these regions, in the Jebel and especially the pre-desert, continued to prosper. So as we can see on the distribution map here, like the unfortified buildings, fortified structures are found throughout Tripolitania, though as just mentioned, only very sparsely in Serdica. So whereas our unfortified buildings were characterized by ranges of rooms and large open spaces, most fortified buildings were very different. Unsurprisingly, and as previously mentioned, these buildings tended to be characterized by features that we traditionally associate with defense. Things like high, substantially built walls, single defensible entrances, few windows, and in some areas, wide surrounding ditches. Many of these buildings were 2 or more stories in height, and they were often sited in far more defensible locations. While unfortified structures tend to be located along the wadi courses, fortified buildings were far more often located on high hilltops or spurs. However, while defense was undoubtedly an important factor in the design and incorporation of many of the characteristics of these buildings, it was not necessarily the only one. And as we'll see, there are other reasons why the adoption of fortified building types may have been desirable. So fortified buildings took many different forms. In terms of their plan, these were usually, but not always, square or rectangular, with rooms arranged around a small courtyard or light well, and particularly in the Jebel regions, wide surrounding ditches, as shown in these examples on the bottom right. It's important to note that in the Jebel and coastal regions, due to poor preservation and modern agricultural activity, unfortunately, we know far less about the specific details of the buildings themselves, and many fortified sites have been identified only by the presence of these wide ditches with large mounds of rubble in the center. The vast majority of the fortified structures identified could be divided again into 2 main types. The first type I termed fortified compound structures. In many respects, these were very similar to the unfortified courtyard buildings of the previous period in terms of their plan, in the sense that they were composed of 3 or 4 ranges of rooms around a courtyard, like the example here, SC17. But far more often than the unfortified counterparts, they also occurred in irregular shapes, often due to siting on irregular hilltops or spurs, like this example of NF33. Fortified compound buildings were not necessarily multi-storied, but may have had 1 or more towers incorporated into their construction. This form was found throughout Tripolitania and accounts for about 1/4 of the fortified buildings in my catalog. Now, far more common, however, was the classic tower-like fortified building, which is what is generally called to mind when people talk about the fortified farmhouses of Tripolitania. These also occurred in all areas of the region, but they were particularly popular and survived particularly well in the pre-desert regions. These multi-storied structures tended to be square or rectangular in plan, with ranges of rooms facing onto a central light well or small courtyard. Upper stories were reached by way of often quite narrow staircases, as we can see in this photograph and drawing of a particularly well-preserved example in the pre-desert, or in other cases, the upper stories might have been reached by wooden ladders or staircases that haven't survived, or even via hand or foot grips that people would need to climb to access the upper stories. The fortified buildings tended to be constructed of high quality regular masonry, though not frequently utilizing ashlar blocks. Sometimes these had additional features like the substantial batter as seen in the example in the upper right, or sometimes externally projecting towers as seen in the plan in the lower right. One important thing to note and that we have to consider with the fortified buildings is that in general, these structures were far smaller than the earlier farmyard and courtyard buildings. And this brings up some interesting questions about the ways in which the spaces both within and around these buildings would have been used, and how that might have changed when fortified buildings began to grow in popularity. If we compare the unfortified farmyard buildings on the left with a couple of these fortified tower buildings at the same scale, you can see that the amount of available enclosed space appears to be drastically reduced, even if we take into account that the fortified buildings had multiple stories that people could use. First of all, we really don't know very much about how those upper stories were used. But I think we can say with some certainty that any activities involving, say, large animals or requiring heavy equipment like pressing would not be taking place in an upper story, leaving us with a much more limited amount of ground floor space for these types of activities. In some cases, the ground floor of these fortified structures could have functioned as a stable for some animals, while upper floors were used for human habitation. And a possible advantage of this setup is that during cold nights, body heat from the animals would rise and help keep the rooms above warm. However, obviously we need a lot more evidence and excavations to take place in these buildings to kind of confirm whether that might have been a possibility. And still, it's clear that it would obviously not have been possible to collect the same number of animals inside one of the small tower buildings as it would have been in the large unfortified farmyards for those situations where it was necessary to gather the whole flock. Earlier, I emphasized how important stock keeping remained in the pre-desert regions, especially, and the limited faunal evidence that we have suggests that this did not change in the later periods. So we have to ask ourselves where these animals would now have been kept, and in general, where other activities that previously took place in these large open spaces were now happening. There are a couple of obvious possibilities. We can consider, of course, that perhaps for one reason or another, these enclosures were no longer seen as necessary. But alternatively, we can consider the possibility that stock enclosures were now constructed of more perishable materials, such as branches or mud brick, or also that they were more often detached from the main habitation buildings. Another possibility is that, in fact, the wide ditches which surrounded many of the fortified buildings in the northern part of the pre-desert and the Jebel not only served a defensive purpose, but also could have served the same purpose of a large farmyard. That is, it was an open area in which one could keep animals and undertake other domestic, agricultural, or productive activities. Now, this is not to suggest that the defensive aspect of these features with which they are normally associated was not still relevant. A building which is itself more fortified and in the center of a ditched compound rather than a range of rooms along the exterior compound wall is indeed more defensible. However, if we consider these interpretations, it becomes clear that the usable space has not been lost, but rather it's simply been distributed in a different way that also, in fact, maximizes defensibility. So it's clear that these fortified buildings and the tower type buildings especially represented a fairly dramatic change in the architecture of the region. So how should we explain the transition between these two very different types of buildings? There are two major related factors that are usually cited that likely contributed to this shift: a decrease in the stability and security of the regions caused by so-called barbarian raids, and perhaps driven by the former, an increase in the stratification of society. Now, to start with the first point, these barbarian raids are known from historical sources, such as Ammianus Marcellinus, who described the situation, in particular the raids of the Asturiani in the 4th century. But we also hear them directly from epigraphic evidence, and in at least 2 instances, barbarian incursions are cited as the reason for the construction of individual fortified buildings in the countryside. The earliest, to my knowledge, is the inscription on the top left, which is from Gazar Dwib in the pre-desert, which is actually a military outpost and dates to the mid-3rd century AD, but specifically mentions these incursibus barbarorum. A second inscription from city Sames in the Jebel, and probably dating to the 4th century AD, though this is admittedly poorly dated, also records barbarian incursions. And although the inscription is fragmentary, this again seems to be cited as the reason for the construction of the building. So there is little reason to doubt that defensibility was a concern which was directly addressed in the construction of these particular building types. The issue of security and defensibility might also have been seen in the increasing tendency for people to live in nucleated settlements, which were centered on these fortified buildings. Often, small settlements clearly grew up around the fortified structures. In times of increased insecurity, there was obviously a clear advantage to living in larger groups and near to a central stronghold into which people could retreat when there was any immediate threat. However, the fact that these clustered groups of buildings and enclosures were often rather haphazardly arranged suggests that in many cases they developed gradually over years or even decades as families and settlements grew. This might support the idea of a process whereby people gradually abandoned their unfortified farms and moved closer to fortified farm buildings rather than this happening all at once. Another piece of evidence which potentially reflects the increasing instability in the region was an apparently drastic reduction in the number of olive presses associated with fortified buildings compared to earlier periods. Here, we again have the distribution of presses recorded at unfortified buildings, and then here the distribution of presses associated with fortified ones. The comparative dearth of presses at fortified buildings compared to unfortified ones would appear to suggest that overall there was a decline in olive oil and/or wine production sites in the centuries following the rise in popularity of fortified buildings. One possible reason for this is that greater insecurity in the region during the 3rd and 4th centuries might have prompted people to reduce their reliance on olives as their main crop because they required such long-term investment. Instead, it's possible that annual crops became more important. And nevertheless, we do still find presses. And where we do find them, these tended to be at the larger, more well-constructed buildings, which more often had associated luxury features. And this could support the idea that despite an apparent overall decline in the industry, those who stuck with it continued to do reasonably well for themselves. We should, however, take this with a grain of salt because there are several reasons why the low number of presses known to be associated with fortified buildings might be misleading. First of all, it's possible that people still used the presses at the unfortified sites, even if no one was living there. The presses were really huge, so it was likely easier to many cases to take the olive to the presses rather than trying to move the presses themselves. In addition, the height of the fortified towers means that when they disintegrate, the ground floors of these structures, that is where you would find the presses, is often completely obscured. So what we're seeing in terms of the distribution of these features is almost certainly a minimum picture only. What's interesting, however, is that if we have a look at the evidence for luxury features, we actually see a different trend from what we saw with the unfortified buildings. So here again, this is the distribution map of luxury features associated with unfortified buildings, and then here for the fortified buildings. And what we see is that unlike the situation with the presses, there has actually been an increase in the incidence of recorded luxury features associated with fortified structures, particularly here in the pre-desert region. This was commonly manifested in the form of monumental sculpted doorways and inscriptions. This development would have been especially striking because of this kind of decoration on unfortified buildings in the same regions was far less common. And I don't know of a single unfortified domestic building in all of Tripolitania which had an inscription, even at ones where we have other indicators of wealth or status like mosaics or marble. In earlier periods, these kinds of decorations or inscriptions were essentially confined to funerary structures. So this seems to indicate some kind of shift in the desire for the wealthy to display their wealth and status in domestic contexts, emphasizing the power and status of the living, not just the dead. So while in the Jebel, and particularly in the coastal regions, there does appear to be some decline in the wealth and prosperity of the rural population, probably connected to the struggles in the urban centers. In the pre-desert regions, all of these trends appear to point to the existence of a prospering local elite who were building and inhabiting these fortified structures. And what this starts to point to is the second commonly cited reason for the fortified building form, that is an increasing stratification of society in later periods, particularly in the pre-desert regions where clearly permanent settlement remained the norm in the 4th and 5th centuries, despite the downturn in Serdica and near the coast. While clearly there were defensive advantages to these buildings, it's also fairly clear that the construction of impressive, well-built fortified towers and compounds, often with decorative embellishments and large dependent settlements, seems to point to a society in which a select group of people had both the means and the desire to advertise their wealth, as well as the status and power that came with it. The substantiality and height of fortified tower buildings, especially, made them an ideal means by which to convey this message, in a far more emphatic way than had been the case with the unfortified buildings. And the contrast between these new buildings and those that already existed in the landscape would have been striking. As already mentioned, fortified buildings were often sited in more defensible, but also therefore more visible and commanding locations in the landscape, that is on hilltops, cliffs, or spurs overlooking the wadis, whereas their unfortified counterparts were often located directly on the slopes or the edges of the wadis. In many cases, as in the examples seen here, the fortified farms were built in very close proximity to the older unfortified ones, and we can suspect that it was actually the same families or groups inhabiting them, but they deliberately sited the new structure in a more prominent location. At the same time, while these buildings were more visible than the landscape, the structures themselves were also much more inward facing. And again, while this had clear defensive advantages, we can also wonder whether this might have been seen as an advantage to an elite class who increasingly wanted more privacy and to separate themselves physically from their dependents. It would have been clear to everyone who viewed these buildings that their construction and maintenance were only achievable by a select group of wealthy and powerful people. Their prominence in the landscape would have drawn attention to them, unmissable constant reminders of the power and resources available to the elite. Their similarity to Roman military architecture, which obviously I've not gone into today, and the significance of which is also a long debated topic, may also have led people to view them as symbols of military power, authority, and legitimacy. So in short, while there's no reason to understate the importance of the defensive aspects of these buildings or to dismiss the idea that security was a motivation in their construction, it's also clear that there were many other reasons why these new building forms and features would have been practical or desirable to an elite class, in addition to their defensive advantages. Now, by the 5th and 6th centuries AD, it seems likely that whatever stability had been provided by the integration of the region into the Roman Empire, and which had made the widespread sedentarization of the 1st century AD possible, was again on the wane, and the number of occupied fortified buildings appears to have begun declining as well. Many of the permanent settlements established in the first 4 centuries AD began to be abandoned, and it's possible that outside the coastal regions, many people probably returned to the semi-nomadic pastoralism that their ancestors had previously practiced, and indigenous leaders and groups once again gained control over the interior. While agriculture and permanent settlement certainly continued into the Islamic period and beyond, it was probably not on the same scale as previously, especially in these pre-desert regions. While the evidence proves that settled agriculture was certainly possible in the pre-desert regions, it required substantially more work to maintain it. And it's possible that without the incentive and support of being part of the Roman economic systems which had helped it develop in the first place, it was no longer worth investing in this form of production and subsistence. So finally, just to sum up and finish up here, it's clear that the rural landscape of Tripolitania and its buildings have already provided scholars over the last 100 years with an astonishing wealth of information about the people who lived in this region. But really, we've only scratched the surface. More archaeobotanical and faunal analyses from sites throughout the region are definitely needed to round out our understanding of what farming and rural life was really like in this region. In addition, more systematic and detailed recording and analysis of construction techniques would be very useful. In order to do proper analyses of construction techniques, it's clearly necessary for people to do studies on the ground, which I obviously wasn't able to do. And a more detailed study of the materials and construction techniques used for these buildings would give us greater insight into the development and spread of building technology and trends. Nevertheless, what I hope I've demonstrated today are some of the interesting things that these rural structures, big and small, have to tell us about ancient life in Tripolitania, but also how much more we still have to learn from them and about them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nichole, for this excellent presentation, which I think really outlined very well what was done in the past, the results of past research, and the gaps that your own research has been trying to fill. So I think that's really, really important. So there is now time for some questions. Just to mention to those who may have joined us late that if you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box, and then I will read it to Nichole. There is one message from David Mattingly, who unfortunately had to leave early, just to say really congratulations for such an amazingly interesting and clear presentation. And you have really moved the debate along. So well done, and that's great. And I completely agree with David's assessment.
Thank you. I will thank him next time I see him.
So I have a question for you. So you showed a slide which indicates the area that you chose to investigate via the analysis of satellite images. I was just wondering more in general about the criteria that you used for choosing those areas, which I think is really something which applies to field work as well and field survey. So what are the criteria for choosing a specific area, and how do you choose it, and what sorts of results you expect?
Yeah, sorry, I just reshared my screen because I think it's always,
yeah, good idea.
Sorry, I'm going to do that very awkward thing where I scroll back through the entire presentation to find that map. Really, it was, there we go.
Yeah.
This was really determined basically by practical concerns. So actually, yeah, and I didn't really go into this, but I actually did two different types of satellite imagery surveys. So you can see over here in these red blocks, what I did here was full coverage survey across these entire blocks. And you can see that I tried to target these in areas where previous surveys hadn't been done. Mm-hmm. But this was also largely driven by the availability of high resolution imagery. Now, I was doing this back in kind of like 2014, probably. And in fact, it's moved along quite a bit, but in these regions, these were actually the only regions where high resolution imagery was available. There was much lower resolution imagery available for these kind of areas around it, but it wasn't high enough resolution to actually see individual buildings. Now, on the other hand, in this area, you can see that effectively I did targeted survey along the wadis. And basically I took as my guide that what basically the previous studies like the ULVS and some of these other surveys that had taken place in Serdica had basically proven that essentially almost all the settlement is based along the edges of the wadis. So it seemed unnecessary to kind of do a survey over and around in the kind of plateaus that were in between the wadi courses. Here, again, you can also see, I obviously only did this small area, and this was just a factor of time. I could have continued on looking for sites, more and more, hundreds, thousands more, endlessly, but this was really just a practical thing where eventually I had to make myself stop so I could actually write the thing up.
Right, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. There is a question from Lisa Fentress, says, thank you, that was great. And I'm curious as to whether there are any nucleated settlement without fortified farms of any date.
Yes, the answer is yes. They are not very large, but what was really interesting, and I unfortunately had to sort of cut for time, was that what I found was that in certain regions, especially in the eastern part of the region, and it was kind of interesting how it differed, you very often do get these little clusters of unfortified buildings, which effectively can be called nucleated settlements. I kind of did kind of like a cluster analysis of buildings, trying to see within certain buffer zones. So I kind of measured how many buildings fell within 50 meters, how many within 100 meters, how many within 500 meters of each other, to kind of identify these little groupings. It was actually really interesting that you get actually settlements of up to like 15 kind of individual little farms that are not necessarily attached, but they're in very close proximity within 200 or 300 meters of each other, which I think formed these little communities along the wadis. In other parts of the wadis, and what you find up here in the Jebel is that it clearly seems to be more based on this estate system where you get one central big courtyard farm, for example, and then in later periods, these fortified farms, and they far less often occurred in proximity to each other. They were usually several kilometers apart, and they were sort of more evenly distributed throughout the landscape instead of featuring in little clusters.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting what you said about the relationship between the rise of fortified settlements and the lower number of presses that you find associated with them, but also that it's not that those olive presses disappear completely. So while probably there was some broader economic reasons for this sort of shrinkage of demand, probably, but the local demand for oil is still somehow traceable in that period, or do you see it more just as a form of local use just specifically limited to the individual settlements?
No, I think that, so sorry, just finding that map again. So, I mean, in the Jebel, you can see that we're still getting incidences of multiple presses at single sites. And now I am not an olive oil production expert. There are other people who know a lot more about this than me, but when you get to the level of like 3 or 4 or 5 presses at a single site, this is still more than subsistence production. This is still production for export. So, I mean, even though it has lessened, so I think there is less of a demand, but clearly there is still some demand because we do still have these kind of factory production level sites here. And indeed, like I mentioned, there are probably many more that they were still using, in fact. So I'm increasingly, in fact, skeptical of my own map. And I think it's very likely that they were still using the presses that were in these other buildings.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah. Right, I don't see any other questions from the audience. And so everything must have been crystal clear, and indeed it was, I think. You explained it very well. Right, so I think we can conclude here. So just a reminder to everybody that this was our last webinar before the summer break. So we will resume our events after the summer, sort of aiming to be able to host a mixed format of in-person and online events if the situation allows it. And so anyway, don't disappear. So just stay with us. There will be some updates from the society during the summer, some important updates. So do keep following us on our social media and website. And then I will see you all after the summer break. I would just like to thank again Nichole for such an excellent presentation tonight. And well, thank you very much and see you all after the summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.